Hello, in this video you will learn how to use Quartz.net for scheduling tasks in .NET 10 in this particular case. This is of course available on some other versions of .NET. Been around for quite a while, a trustworthy library. Essentially it helps you sort of properly schedule the tasks, and you can arrange the cron job, as it would be called, in various ways. So not just every 5 minutes, but for example every day, at every hour, on weekdays. At the end of the video we'll get some of those arrangements, how you can actually mark them up. We will go through the setup, and then you will see how you can sort of set all those specific times in that specific format. And there are plenty of options to do that. Now, first of all, we can take a look at the NuGet packages. You simply install Quartz. That's all you need, the library. Of course, you would probably be running this in some kind of a Windows service, some kind of arrangement like that, and there's plenty of ways to do that now. You don't have to necessarily do Windows service as a sort of old-fashioned way. You can run these on Linux as well, with several sort of different tools, and maybe we'll do a video about that in the future with a bit of interest. But let's get started with the actual setup. We first need to create the actual job that we'll use. So it's not exactly executing just a simple method. We need to do a bit of a setup. So let's go down here just quickly. In this case, just hello job. Essentially, it will print hello to the console. Nothing sort of fancy at all, and nothing perhaps too interesting. But the interesting part is the actual structure here. So you essentially implement the IJob interface into your class, and then you have your execute method. Now, the good thing about this is it's not just a sort of simple, perhaps, service that will be able to run something in a loop, and you might have a custom loop and it will run forever. This way, you can actually have many jobs. And in fact, what you can also do, if say you have a .NET 10 API, perhaps a minimal API, you can just add this in that same application and run it as a website, maybe Blazor server website you might have, and just run it inside there. So you don't need even to do additional application. You can just register the job thing, create several jobs, perhaps some cleanup jobs. If you don't have sort of huge performance requirement on this sort of thing, then it's quite easy to do, and you won't need to mess with sort of additional overhead of having a separate program. Alternatively, of course, if you have higher loads, you might want to use something like RabbitMQ. You can check out our previous video on this channel covering how to set up and how to use RabbitMQ. Very easy and straightforward setup. There are a few sort of bits and pieces that can be a bit tricky. That's all covered in that video, so take a look at that if you're interested. But essentially, we just use execute, and whenever the time comes, and we'll set that up to execute whatever it is in this method, that will be executed based on the time that you set up. So you don't need your custom loop and custom delay. We do have a low delay, but that's just to sort of simulate the job. And every so often, it will run. Now, of course, you would add other methods here, but essentially that execute will execute on the time that you set. So just the actual setup. The idea is sort of simple. You need to set up a scheduler factory. All right, that's the main thing you sort of do, and from there you can add as many jobs essentially as you want for that particular schedule. So in this case, we get the scheduler from a factory, and you can have several of these factories set up, but usually you just need one, and then you start it. So you start it, that's great, that's good. Nothing too fancy and no real setup here yet. However, where we have the setup is for each job. So again, you can essentially reuse the factory, and you can reuse the scheduler as well. In the factory. As long as it's started, it will be able to take as many jobs as possible. And this is how you create the job. You use that class with the IJob inheritance. And then you want to add a bit of an identity here. You have the name, but more importantly, you want to have the group. Now, the group, what it will do, it will allow you to implement those specific intervals for those specific groups, so you can have separate ones. The name isn't so important perhaps, but the group is what essentially will determine the whole thing. So we create the job, and then for the job, for each job, or not for each job, for several jobs, you can have a trigger. All right, so the trigger can be reused. And of course, the job can also be reused if you want to have several triggers, perhaps, so different schedules and whatnot. Maybe you want to run it every week, but also every month as well, just a sort of additional kind of a thing. But as you can see, the identity needs to match the group. So we have the job, group 1, and we have the trigger going into group 1 as well. Now, the name is not for the job name, the identity is now for the trigger. So you have this as a job name, you don't need to specify that in the trigger or anything else, you just have those names. The groups do need to match, and we can start now right away. It will, once it goes into the actual scheduler, it will be started, and of course, depending on how you set it up, usually it will be on the program start. You'll set up essentially the factory, the scheduler, and you start. So it starts, and everything else can go into sort of a separate kind of method, or some other arrangement where it's actually added. It could be also added dynamically as needed, or removed as well. So we create with identity, start now, and this is the main sort of arrangement. Now, when you're getting the cron job settings from app settings, for example, it will be slightly different, and we'll get into that. But the intervals, in this case, we have interval in seconds, so every 5 seconds it will go. Now, as I mentioned previously, there is a format, and we will get to that, but you can do interval in hours, interval in minutes, and you can do some error handling as well. We won't probably get into that too much in this video, but you can also set the amount of time it repeats if you, again, have something a bit more custom. But essentially, once you set up the job, once you set up your trigger, all you need to do is take the reference to the scheduler, and then you schedule the job. You provide the job, which will be executed, and the trigger. And other than that, for this example, we just keep the app essentially running all the time. So this is the basic setup, but now let's get into, let's make a few changes, and let's get into that sort of proper cron job setup with their sort of own syntax. Now, let's look at this sort of a bit different example. Essentially, the idea is the same, the job is still the same, it's just how we set the schedule. In this case, we use something called cron expression. Essentially, that's some kind of a time interval, right? So, and it can be different sort of arrangements. Now, the way you read it, it can be a bit complicated, but the suggestion would be these days to just use perhaps AI tool to generate whatever interval you want. And of course, you need to try and verify it to some extent. But doing it manually is probably not a good idea, although you need at least some understanding on what is actually being said. Because as you can see, if you just look at it, it's kind of complicated. Now, what we have here, the 15 seconds, you have your first index essentially, and that is the seconds, right? Now, the question mark here, that essentially means no specific value. So in this case, for the day of month, this one would be day of month, right? We don't have any specific value, it doesn't matter. Everything else, basically anything fits. So as long, this would be the hour, rather the minute, so every minute, and then this one would be every hour, it doesn't matter, and then this would be every month, and the last one is probably the most interesting one. It's day of the week. So the last one example here, now it changes. So we do 1, that's the first off day of the week. So again, it gets quite complicated, and if you want to do it yourself, not generate it or use one of the tools available online to set this in motion, again, it's not recommended for sure, because as you can see, it's quite complicated, and depending on whether you want to do the last day or something else, you'll need to change these numbers around, like every 5 minutes here. So here we have asterisk, slash, and 15 for the first one, because that's the seconds. But in this case, that goes to the next position, and that becomes minutes. So now here we have asterisk slash, which is every something 5 minutes, right? So in this case, it's minutes every 5. If you move that here, it would be every 5 hours. But again, use either tools available online to just spit it out, or you just use simple AI tools. Usually it's good enough. But of course, you do need to test it. Now, one last thing to mention, in this case, you just use with cron schedule, and you put this expression. Of course, usually the way you do it, you put it in app settings somewhere, so it's a bit cleaner. You don't have to put it in hard-coded as such. And you can then mess around with different test environments, maybe try it out somewhere every 10 minutes just to see if everything works, and then just switch it to every several days, because obviously once you get to months, first day of month, that becomes very difficult to test, because if you want to see if it works the next time, you'll have to wait for a month. Now, with that said, the code will be available on Patreon, as well as most of the other code samples for the videos on this channel. And do check out the RabbitMQ. It can certainly go well together with one of these sort of asynchronous tasks arrangements. And with that said, we will conclude this video.